For for the next couple of lessons, you can be researching a bit more into computer hardware. Make your notes, please, in Google Documents about this, not on separate pages. And definitely don't create a PowerPoint to start with, please. So the basic concept of a computer that's needed, and what's needed to be actually a computer, is some memory, some processor, which actually does the hard work. It's the brains of the computer. Some sort of system memory for storing information, potentially storing the programs, although programs can be stored both in RAM or ROM, which isn't shown on here. There are certain types of program, like the BIOS, stored on ROM. Older computers, even the operating system was on ROM, although that's less common now. Although, yeah, your mobile phone, if that is a computer, yeah, they're stored on ROMs, or more specifically EEPROMs. They're special systems that allow you to have, when the power's turned off, the ROM stuff does not disappear. It's called read-only memory. I'll leave it for you to find out what RAM is about. Generally, the RAM, the CPU, and the other essential part, which is some form of input and output, are controlled by some bus. And what a bus allows is transmission of a destination and the transmission of data. So it says where the information is going to or from, and what information is being passed, the actual numbers as bits. These are normally quite wide traces going through lots of computer sections. You'll see in some older, this Northbridge-Southbridge change, it seems to be going out now. Everything seems to be going to PCEI buses, not the PCI, PCEI. PCEI has a slight advantage. If I tell you what Northbridge is what's called a wide bus. It's very fast information transfer, but it takes a lot of separate lines to transfer the information. Over the Southbridge, you're going to more and more hardware-based things like controllers for the USB, the input-output controllers, and these tend to use fewer data lines. So what we have is the Northbridge is for fast communication to things like memory and to graphics cards, to pass lots of data very quickly. And then when you talk to slower devices, there's less data needed. You don't speed needed, so you don't need as many lines to transmit things over. So they get reduced on the Southbridge. This whole structure, though, is being changed by PCIe, which consists of a number of different channels of almost serial bus. There's an in and out piece of data, and it communicates very quickly, which has benefits that you haven't got to route lots of different wires, and you also don't get what's called crosstalk. That's a benefit. Last part on a main computer, though, is there needs to be some form of way of getting things in and out of the computer. So moving on. What's the next? You can go back even further with these, but the modern structure of a computer really started in the 1960s. Towards the end of the 1960s, we started getting computers that were cheap enough for people to buy as hobbyists, and departments in universities to have multiple copies of. Prior to this, you had one big computer for the whole university or whole place. People didn't have a computer on their desk. So late 1960s, this computer called an Altair was created, and it's the forerunner to most modern desktop computers and computers of that type, although it is the foundation of the Unix operating system, which is the basis of most modern operating system design. The computer itself consisted of two things called backplanes. There's the one on the bottom, which is basically the bus, which says pass the information and where the information is going to. And you've got blanking plates at the back that allow connections to go out of the back of the computer. In fact, that's the front. You had, it's over here. You can actually run blocks through that side. Each part of the computer was put onto a separate card and it was plugged into a standard connection. So you could actually put a computer core on any card you like, and you could put the RAM elsewhere. There were certain configuration parameters, but the memory was just lots of chips on a board and it was slotted in. The computer was lots of chips on a board and slotted in. This board seems to have a small amount of memory as well as the CPU, and that is the CPU, Central Processing Unit. A lot of the other bits on this are probably to do with communications and actually controlling the bus. The old Altair, you could actually, the way it was actually programmed, its main input and output was this panel on the front, where there were a lot of little toggle switches that could be on or off, and they responded with LEDs. So you programmed it by giving it an address to some of these switches and a value, and you then said set, and you could put a program in, and you could put your data in, and you had to set every single value separately because there was no form of backup generally in the early versions. Eventually they created some things for hard disks and storing information, and this is the genesis of what's called a Unix operating system. And that when you put a network card in, you could actually wind up with a screen and a keyboard away that actually communicated with the computer a lot better, and the hard disk store information. So this is actually the nexus of the modern computer. Same ideas got extended. A guy called Bill Wozniak was a hobbyist computer engineer, and he was trying to build a computer. At a meeting of hobbyists, he met Steve Jobs and they got together to design a computer. But Bill Wozniak soldered most of these bits together for the Apple I. It's still got those key components, but they're now all on one board. And the board has a processor. The ROM contains the operating system in its entirety. So the Apple I and Apple Basic system was all there, and it was almost immediately available because this is memory. The usable memory was over here, and I think this was about 4K of memory. 4K now won't hold anything like an image that you would be able to recognize what you're looking at. You had input and output ports, so this was actually an extension of, there is actually a bus that runs through this, connecting the computer, the memory, and all the other circuits, and this was actually the bus extension. There were some further pins out here for further extension, partly sound, and the display controller was a circuitry in the corner to actually put things on a screen. All of that's on one board. Over time, people realised that, new technology is coming along, and they created expansion slots, things like this. It appeared in Apple II. So you could actually buy a card, a bit like with the Altair, put memory in and put extra memory into your computer. So early motherboards were fairly simple. They were almost back to being the same as the backplane in the Altair, but they have controlling circuits. And most motherboards that came along afterwards, they also contain the BIOS, the thing that can actually communicate to other devices, things like hard disks down here, to say, give me some program to run. And the program then does what's called bootstrapping. It says, right, go and get this information, which is the next bit of the operating system, and then go and get this bit of the operating system. And gradually that builds up from a hard disk over here, generally. The processors go in the top. They've been through a few variations, from the old chips now to being these chips with hundreds of pins, and they got dropped into a board like this. For a short time, Intel played with going back to blades, because you could put a CPU and a lot of very fast memory very close together on that board and run a lot quicker, rather than communicating to the main system memory here at a slower rate, and that's called caching. You'll notice on this motherboard there's some I/O is actually still is now on the board and stays there. Originally, in the first forms of these motherboards, everything had to be on its own card and plugged in. But these modern ones, you've got things like USB ports, parallel controller, serial controller. I think I saw an NIC at the top there as well, this network controller. And then as you go come down, if you want to put more facilities on, you can put a graphics card on it, or you put a graphics card into the early ones. Most modern computers, you'll find a graphics chip built in here as well, normally a little blue plug. And you could expand with new USBs. This is why the expansion card idea is useful, because as new technology comes along, you don't have to buy a new computer, you can plug a new board in. So that's the rough history very quickly. What I'd like you to do for this lesson and this week's research is to research the computer components. We're not discussing keyboard, screens, printers, the peripherals. That was year 7. We are not discussing what goes into a CPU to make it at this time. So after cache memory, anything going on inside the CPU, we're not worried about. You might want to mention cache memory because it can be attached to the bus. There are often 3 or 4 levels of cache in a computer nowadays. But we're not talking about the internals of a CPU at this time. What you need to be able to describe are the CPU, system memory, both ROM versions and what's it used for and what do the letters mean. So CPU, what does the letters mean? RAM, what do the letters mean and what's it used for? Describe the purpose of the system bus is. There's at least 2. Sometimes you get multiple ones. Describe the purpose of a mother or backplane. What are they allowing to do? What do they do for the computer components inside? What controller cards are and what they do. So a quick history of, like I've just gone through, this idea of being able to plug in new hardware. And certain controllers now have been merged back into a motherboard. Make sure you describe what each part of this system does and try and research the history of each of these technologies. Okay, so that's your work for the day.